If you've been with me before, welcome back. These are the texts for the fourth Sunday of Eastertide, which will be Sunday, April the 21st. Our first text is from Acts, the fourth chapter, beginning in the 5th verse through the 12th verse. I suggest that we really ought to go through the 22nd verse to get the full impact of this half of the story. This takes place just after a healing has taken place by Peter and John in the temple grounds of a crippled man. And the powers that be, scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, rulers, elders of the people, pull them aside and arrest them, throw them in prison, and they congregate the next day and bring Peter and John before them to testify. And that's where our story really picks up. And it names some of the names, a couple of names that we're aware of from the accounts of the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. At any rate, there's a fascinating element that starts this, because when they begin to question Peter and John, Peter speaks up, and the text says he was filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, there's nothing fancy about what happens, but he speaks in a way that has power and authority. You may recall that Jesus said that when he was going away, that he would send the Comforter, but he also indicated that with the Comforter, that the Spirit would be one that would allow them to say whatever they needed to say when the gospel was at crisis and they were to give testimony for the gospel. That fits well, this notion of they were filled with the Spirit when Peter began to speak, and what happens after they have spoken when these scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, learned men, and elders of the community first say about these two, these are ignorant men. I mean, they're uneducated, and yet they speak with such authority. And the text says that these people were amazed at how they spoke. So the indication of their spirit-filledness was the quality of their speech as well as the content of their speech, which shocked these learned, powerful people. But there's way more to this text than that. One of the little places that to me is potent, in verse 10, there's a word used for that says heal. It also means you can translate that same word that this man was healed as this man was made whole again. The word is sozo. It also, by the way, means salvation. And that's how it is translated in our English in verse 12. So in verse 10, it is about this man being made whole. In verse 12, it's about being saved, and that there is no other name under heaven by which one is saved except by Jesus Christ. So I like to think of it, sometimes we think of salvation too narrowly, or maybe we think of healing too narrowly. So I suggest, as a reading, read both verses 10 and 12 using the same word both times, whether you want to use the word saved or you want to use the phrase made whole. So verse 10 could read, let it be known to all of you and to all people of Israel that this man standing before you, instead of saying in good health, is made whole or saved by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Same in verse 12. There is no being made whole, there's no salvation in anyone else, for there's no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we are made whole, by which we are saved, by which we are healed. All of those mean the same. And to me, that is a potent thing. Let me just back up. uh, uh, the word salvation typically, until this time of Jesus, always had to do with political salvation. But isn't that also part of being made whole? Um, would we say that the people of Iran, for example, or the people of China under authoritarian rule, where they fear for the speech that they may render, as we witnessed mostly recently in Hong Kong, we wouldn't say that they are whole. So this notion of being whole, of being saved, is a very expansive notion, and it gets its full expanse in our understanding of the meaning of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. One other little element, these powerful men, these scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, and ruling class of Jerusalem, in trying to discuss what to do with Peter and John, they finally decide just to let them go. And why? Because the man they healed, they say, is well known. How do we know he's well known? It says he is over 40. So those of you who've been in classes with me before about that word 40, whether his age was really known or not, what it really says is he's been around a long time and everybody knows who he is. You know, one of those fixture type characters. You know, how long's he been here? Gee, I don't know. He's been here as long as I've ever known. So that may be a better way to think of 40, not just his age, but he's been around so long that multiple generations, and who doesn't know him anymore is probably a better way to say. And so they figure they better let Peter and John go before they stir up more about this man whose healing has been witnessed by so many. The psalm for the day is Psalm 23. I've talked about that on multiple occasions, and every time I try to pick a highlight or two to speak about. I want to speak about this one, I think, one way a little differently, that I think speaks to what was going on with Peter and John being called before these rulers after having been thrown in prison. And then something else which is just kind of fun, I think, about the psalm. The first is, this is clearly a psalm about confidence, that somehow, no matter what is going on in life, we can feel confident that our lives are led and protected by the Lord. I think that really is the overall notion of the psalm. The artistry in the psalm is multi-layered, and I've talked about some of those layers before. So beyond this overall comprehensive picture of confidence, which we can certainly see in Peter and John standing before these powers that be, there's some wonderful little pieces. I've talked about the rod and the staff before, and about protection and weapons that the shepherd has. I've also talked about spreading the table, but that's a good one. I think there's a double meaning here. The first meaning has to do with a shepherd. There was a phrase, an idiomatic phrase, spreading the table, is what a shepherd did when he found a new field for the sheep to graze in. Before the sheep would go into that field, the shepherd would go into the field and try to scout out scorpions' nests, snakes' nests, as in poisonous snakes. He would scout it out to see if there were places to where predators like wolves and wild cats might be able to pounce on sheep. He tried to clear it of all of the items that might harm his sheep, and then let the sheep go in to graze. That is spreading the table. So when we hear in Psalm 23, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, that certainly fits with the notion of a shepherd. It could also fit with a notion of what happened in the tabernacle, or in the temple once the temple was formed after the time of David. And that is, if someone were accused of a crime, they could seek sanctuary in the temple. And as the crime was being adjudicated out of fear of being lynched by someone, as the crime was being adjudicated, they lived in the temple or on the temple grounds. And so even their enemies might be worshipers, but they ate there on the temple grounds, and hence they ate in the presence of their enemies, and their enemies could do nothing about it because they were under the protection of the Holy One until such time as their crime could be adjudicated. So it seems that there could be a meaning there that would be very helpful for garnering confidence, in the sense of Peter and John standing before these authoritative figures and giving their testimony about Jesus. I was about to jump over some other wonderful little piece of this Acts text as well. Peter directly accuses the people. I'm looking for the exact verse here. Down in verse 11, this Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders. This is a quote out of the Psalms, or Peter is paraphrasing out of the Psalms, where the stone that was rejected by the builders has become the head of the corner. But Peter is fingering these fellows. This stone that was rejected by you, the builders, he says, has become the cornerstone. And there's no salvation under any other name under heaven. Think back, it's only a few weeks before that Peter was running and hiding from a maid in the garden of the house of the high priest. And yet here he is before the very powers themselves, and he's filled with the confidence of the Spirit and can speak to these people in terms that they understand, with a language they cannot discount because of his eloquence. Hence, he's filled with the Holy Spirit. So I jumped from the Psalm back to Acts, and now we're going to move from the Acts text and the Psalm into 1 John 3, verses 16 to 24. This whole section of 1 John, I would say, encompasses our understanding of justification by the grace of God and sanctification by the demonstration of the works of the people of faith who've been justified. It's really kind of a hard notion to think about justification and sanctification, particularly the sanctified part. And why? Because every one of us can do a good deed. It doesn't take a Christian to do a good deed. Anybody can do a thing out of obligation or out of pity of somebody else. So, and all good deeds are wonderful. Make no mistake about it. Every time a Boy Scout helps a little old lady across the road, which is kind of in our minds as what scouts do, that's a good deed. A scout may feel obligated to do it, but it's a good deed. I think it's helpful to read this text with a sense of what true sanctification is. And that is when we catch ourselves in the middle of a good deed that we felt compelled to do out of a genuine love for someone else other than our child or our parent or our spouse or a good friend. But when we are caught up in doing something for someone else and we realize, oh my gosh, we are extending ourselves in the way of our time or our talent or our treasure, when this was something that we did not feel under an obligation to do, but we just did it, then that demonstrates in that kind of a doing that we have this particular love of God that we may never have thought about. The whole text is really about love in action. And the text says in its own way, or rather explicitly, that true love is an act. It is not something that's spoken. It is an action. It also moves on from there to let us know that we don't always know how we're supposed to behave in an instant. That the life of faith is not without its dilemmas of conscience. And sometimes we really don't know our way forward in that dilemma of conscience. For example, when it comes to acts of love, there is such a thing as hard love, right? To where the best response to a particular need is not to help in the way that we often think of help. Sometimes not to help is the best kind of help, but we're not always sure which way to go at certain moments. So these lead to struggles with our conscience. And the text wants to assure us that even then, in those struggles in our conscience, that the Lord is with us as we wrestle with those decisions. It doesn't say we're always going to make the right decision, but the Lord is with us. This gives us a true way of understanding our pilgrimage in the life of faith, our pilgrimage in our ongoing love of our Heavenly Father. Our last text is from the Gospel of John. And you know, I struggle with the Gospel of John, not in its veracity, but really in its complexity. And I think our challenge always in reading the Gospel of John, almost anywhere we want to read in the Gospel of John, is not to embrace what appears to be a simple text, but to really look carefully and realize that almost everywhere in the Gospel of John there is layer after layer after layer. There's subtlety, there's nuance, there's hints of other texts that really defy a simplistic look at the gospel. I think probably I have preached on John less than other texts because sometimes I think it's too complex for good preaching. Now that's just me. There are plenty of people that preach on John. They can see the simple message, and there are plenty of those. But I think the full glory of the Gospel of John is in probing its complexity, and it always leaves me more with a wow sense as opposed to a simple sense. The text today in chapter 10, I really don't know where to fit it. It does fit in a group of texts about the Good Shepherd, but it almost stands alone and separate from those other Good Shepherd texts that begin in chapter 10. So I really like to take pains almost to say it's best to pull chapter 10 verses 11 through 18, our text of the day, separate from those other two. So read the whole chapter there and see if you don't see how verses 11 to 18 are separate from the other. There are a couple of issues with this. Chronological, and see, John is not a chronological book like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but chronologically, does it fit with what comes afterward? Is this taking place at the time of the festival of dedication in Jerusalem, which we pick up on in verse 22, or is it or the other is it a literary issue, which I've just mentioned? Does it fit with the things about Good Shepherd that come before? It's too bad John's not here to ask him some of these questions, because I think it would enlighten us. And I will tell you, I think it's really a debate of scholarship here as to where you put it. And I don't think there's any really perfect answer that leaves me with an aha moment. Oh, so this is how the text fits. That's a long way around saying the text is about the Good Shepherd, and it compares the Good Shepherd with a hired hand, and how a Good Shepherd will defend the flock with his own life, whereas a hired hand, well, when the going gets tough, the hired hand will run away. There is one verse in here, though, that well, there's several, but there's the one in particular I think that for me fits in with this text and shows the complexity. It's verse 16, where Jesus says, "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock, one shepherd." John, of course, like all the Gospels, is writing well after the fact of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Well after the fact. In this text, is the voice of Jesus referring to all of the different splits in the church that are already occurring early on, and where several of the churches are not in true fellowship with each other, but think they are the possessors of the truth, whereas the other folks are not the possessors of the truth? Or is Jesus here referring to a more universal sense, that there are other people out there beyond those who don't even know they're a part of the true flock, that Jesus must find his way to reach? And so the dilemma falls on Jesus to reach those other persons who do not know the voice of the true shepherd. I think both of those are possible. There is no good answer here. I think true scholarship is really divided about those. For me, I've always fallen on an experience I've had in my own life. At different times in a more of a discussion setting, someone has asked me, well, what about people that have never known Jesus? Do they experience the salvation that comes from Christ? And the way I like to describe that is, in my own life, as I've grown older, probably closer to the truth, I'd like to think so, than I was in previous years in life. I've become much more of a merciful person to other people. I know God's mercy is greater than my own, because there's still people I'm not very merciful about. People, even within the so-called Christian faith, that I'm not very merciful about, and I certainly doubt their faith, just like I'm sure some people doubt mine. But as great as my mercy is, I know Christ's mercy is even greater. He died for people who didn't know him, right? Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And so when I've had funerals for people, particularly those whom in my own sense of their lives have had no connection at all with Christ or Christ's church, I always pick texts and speak about the mercy of God, because I know God's mercy is greater than mine. And so I leave that responsibility up to God and his son Jesus, as to how far and with what great passion Jesus reaches out to others, because I know his passion is greater than mine. Well, that is probably a good enough way to end our lesson for today. Here in this Eastertide season, we're certainly very aware of our Christ, who died, as the text says elsewhere, once for all. And it's within that light that we read these texts during Easter. I look forward to connecting again with you next week.